here. So today we're doing the literature review. Last week I have already indicated a particular structure that I will be teaching you in order for you to see how to do the literature review. So I'm just thinking what would be the easiest way for me to approach it today so that I wouldn't take your time. So I'm thinking that maybe the easiest way is to actually, okay, so maybe I will start first where I want to end the class, and that will help those students who just are here just to get the answer. However, I think that the answer may not be enough without all the context. So once I show you this slide and we discuss it, then I will take you through an exercise that will explicate this better, and maybe it will create enough of connections for you to see the reason for this particular structure. So in assignment 1, all of you were writing, or most of you have written, on the concept of significance. Significance not for you. Significance for you was in the section of the introduction of a study, right? So you were in a placement or on a placement in school, and you noticed particular issues, they made you ponder, and you wrote about it in terms of what you believe that ITIL says that it's important for you to know, what other experiences you might have collected that made you think that a particular aspect of classroom practice is of concern to you and you would like to learn more. So that was introduction, but the significance section and aims was about how significant, was about assessing whether the thing that concerns you actually is relevant in terms of policies, because you could come up with something that actually is not. So then you would have to go back to your introduction and actually rethink your focus. So that's what we did. In assignment 1, which practically was a research proposal, you reviewed the concept of the issue of your interest against the policies, like the different declarations, different policies for health, or for closing the gap, or the Australian curriculum or early years framework, for you to kind of get a bit of an understanding about the relevance of that issue in Australia or in a state where you teach. So I would suggest now that as you are starting your literature review, you write a small introduction where you now, on the basis of what you have written, summarize the key points of your framework. Now, some of you would be surprised and might say, well, I never wrote about these things. This could be true, that you did not integrate these aspects of classroom teaching maybe in your assignment 1. You didn't have to, in a sense that it was your reflective engagement in policies, and it was your first attempt to create a framework. Remember, maybe in some earlier years you were asked by different colleagues of mine to write your framework for teaching, right, for practice, in your content area, in your subject area, your framework or your approach, or how you understand how you would be teaching, right? So that's what it is. So on the one hand, in assignment 1, you wrote how your specific problem relates to policies. But if you did not write about the issues which I call the big picture, then now maybe you can, on the basis of what you have written, add some things. So maybe you could now, in bullet points or in a short paragraph, produce a statement that very quickly but succinctly summarizes your framework. What's the key objective of your classroom? So today I was reading a particular paper. We might use its abstract later on, And again, I'm saying again because I've seen it in other papers, the concept of your classroom's objectives, big picture objectives, very often is missing. That's probably because people think these things either don't matter or they don't understand them very well. But if you do not understand the big picture of your key objectives in your classrooms, not the not the content outcomes or subject outcomes, content areas, but the big picture, then maybe it's worth investigation. In any case, if you could look at your framework that you've written in assignment 1 and now summarize it with key points and add maybe things to it about the key objectives that actually in which your classroom is embedded. Where do they come from, right? So the specific policies. Where did you get these objectives from? So when I just submitted the paper for publication, but probably I'll get 3,000 reviews, corrections to make probably, I don't know. But anyway, when I was doing a review of literature in Cambodia, yes, the concept of policies and the objectives was totally absent there. So where did you find those key objectives in which your classroom is embedded? What policies? How do they construct students? Right? How do these policies construct the role of a student in your classroom? Or how do they construct the students and their role in classroom? How do they construct your role as a teacher? Also the role of resources, whether they text or technology or whatever. These are the big picture things. Unless you have statements on all these things, you cannot do a literature review. In fact, you cannot teach. You really have to have a framework that constructs a tight text that describes your, I don't want principles, right? The principles that guide your behavior in classroom and whatever you do in classroom. So on the basis of the framework and with addition maybe of a few other points, I would like you to make these little statements on these, this little statement on these that integrates these issues. Once you've done that, every article you read, what I would like you to do is to summarize them. Each article would have its own summary, unless 2 or 3 articles do the same thing. So you can say Lyon and Smith, Smith and Peterson, I don't know, whatever others, do the same thing, right? So then you can actually collate them together. But otherwise, I would like you to actually follow this process. What do the authors discuss? I will teach you now, once I finish this slide, I'll teach you what it means, right? So we're basically at the conclusion slide at the moment. So what did the authors discuss? Why? What concepts did they contrast, right? Because you usually write an article to explicate or to respond to a problem. So, there was something bad and here it is, I have something better, right? So what concepts did they contrast? And now what did they do with these concepts, right? So what was the methodology of their research? What did they do? Did they construct an experiment, whatever? What findings did they report? What did they recommend as a result, right? So these are the sort of things that you need to have in your literature review, in your summaries of articles that you actually will include in your literature review. Now, obviously, I have already spoken before about it. When you say Lyon doesn't like the Australian curriculum, you cannot say that. You have to find a quote to demonstrate that your interpretation is correct, right? So you cannot say Peterson is against the particular thing, right? And put the dot and then move on to the next sentence of yours. You are not in the position as an undergraduate student to make these statements. You have to evidence it with a quote that demonstrates that your interpretation is correct. Okay, so I've said that. So once you finish all of that, those little points, I don't know how many of them are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then what I would like you to do is to add something from yourself on these points. And now analyze what the authors did or recommended through this process, but in relation to your framework here. So you analyze whether the subject was, whether what they discussed, what problem was the article addressing, and the conclusion the article reached, and all of that. You analyze in relation to the principles or values that you have explicated in your framework, to say whether they address those things. Hi Brittany, I have to talk now because we're recording, so just have to continue. So so you analyze whether, so once you've done all of that, you analyze every paper that you have discussed in reference to these principles or values, whether these authors actually address these things or ignored. It's important because you can actually ignore these things, and consequently the article is not relevant for your, well, it's relevant for this particular research, but its role in your practice as a teacher is a little bit diminished, because your job is governed by these big objectives, not by someone saying, oh, well, the authors discussed what? The importance of teaching grammar, and the recommendation was the more grammar you teach, the better, right? So that only would be a good strategy by the authors if the big objectives that hold your classroom are actually, you know, that we want students who, what kind of students do we want? The policies, you know, Australia wants students that know grammar. I haven't seen policies like that, but yeah. So that's a summary of where I want you to be with your literature review. And now I will go to specifics of it to show you more about this slide, so that we can actually create a better understanding here. So regarding this particular I've lost the slide again, would you believe it? So, because I expect it to look a little bit more colorful, and it doesn't. So if we were to think about what the authors discuss and the recommendation, you would want really that this and that are connected. So I'll show you now what it means. So when you want to discuss what the authors, when you want to actually write what the authors talked about, so when students write summaries, very often students say, so if you say to the student what was the story about, so say about, let's think that we were summarizing the story about the fable about the how the kangaroo got its pouch. So when I ask my undergraduate students, probably 70% of students would say, well, the story was about the kangaroo but was roaming around. And then so they retell the story. Summarizing is not retelling. So let me say the following. When you write about what the article was about, you really want to say that in such a way that it actually correlates with the recommendations of the paper. Now, if you cannot make that connection between what the paper was about and what the paper recommended, then either you are wrong and you need to think harder, or they were confusing, and then you have to say it, right? You have to say that in the whole paper they talked about grammar, and what they did, actually it was different. I read the paper written by a person trained in Melbourne University, in the University of Melbourne, and that person, I wrote the paper, and she said, well, I'm teaching students literacy skills to support the transformative skills, lifelong learning and all of that, all these big skills. And then what did she recommend? I swear to you, she said, students need more grammar. So there was this disconnect between the big objectives, transformative education, all these great skills, lifelong learning skills, and we ended up at the end, what I often see in Asian papers, which is students need more grammar. So there was a disconnect, and I can prove it because I can quote it, right? So if you find disconnect like this, so then you point to it. But basically what you really want is to read the paper and then think to yourself, what was it about? So don't retell, you summarize. Well, it was about compassion, and the recommendation was that compassion always rewards. Now, so I will go on, Brittany, and I will then come back. So when we summarize papers, we really want to make sure that we summarize, we don't retell. And to do that, we check the correlation between what the paper in our view was about and what it recommended. So we're done with that. And I think I've done something like this. Where did I do that? I'll show you an example. So I divided this paper. So here was the abstract. I'll show you the abstract. The full abstract looked like this. So this was black. Right, so that was the abstract of the paper, because you really want to read the abstract first to see whether whether you can actually use the abstract for your summary. So you get the detail from the paper, but you could use the abstract for summary. Right, so this was how they started the paper. But the way they concluded was, we want an end to reading wars, right? So, so they indicated that there is a disagreement among educators and the public about how to teach reading, and they basically said that they think that that should actually no longer be, because there's enough of answers in the literature to overcome it. So I divided this abstract to help myself to understand it better. So so there's this intense discussions. They say we should end all the wars. So there is a correlation here. Now, these people were saying, there are answers in psychological science. You always are very wary when you hear about answers. I think that we could say that there is evidence pointing to some systematicities, That's one way to say it. But when I see that there is an answer, I'm thinking to myself, well, you need to be very careful here, because I've done obviously it's part of my research to teach literacy, and I love my work, but hardly I would call it that I've got the answers, right? And I draw on evidence, and I draw on evidence from, well, psychological and from neuroscience, right? But to call it the answers, anyway, so so there is reliable evidence on which we can draw, that's for sure. So basically what they were saying here, there is conflict. What we're saying here is that we need to, so the problem that they addressed in their paper is to say, look, we need, current research is not looking into the science of psychology of reading, so that's why the problem happens. So we need to be actually expand the scope of our study to actually have some more definite conclusions. So what did they compare? So in this particular study, they compared what people, the new, so the yellow one, the new understandings that the research suggests, and what people currently think, which is the green one. And what they did, they so here they wrote about what they did in the study, and that they say the conclusion of this paper in the abstract is that we believe we should end all the reading wars and provide what? Instruction in reading acquisition that is balanced, developmentally informed, and based on a deep understanding of how language and writing systems work. So when you read abstracts like this or papers like this, now what I wanted to say, it seems like it is very easy to just summarize all these things and say, now we know this, right? So to avoid youth being carried around like a leaf in the current, by the current on in a stream, fast flowing stream, you need something steady. And this is the skill that you need to learn, not only for the purpose of assignment 2, but forever. You always, so you can summarize what the paper is about. Does this correlate with the recommendations? Then you can say what problems they talk about, what they compared, how they compared things, right? So you can say all of that. But fundamentally, what you need, ultimately what you need to do is to return to your framework, I think here, right? So once you've done all of this, you told us what they discuss and why and what things they compared and all of that, then you need to present your perspective on it. And the only way you can present your perspective on it is when you actually articulate, just before you start your literature review, your framework. So here, this framework, just to reiterate, because it wasn't recorded on the university system, because I didn't click the voice, to reiterate, this framework here, which precedes your literature review, it's like an introduction to your literature review, comes from your assignment 1, where you laid out the relevance of your subject of study from the perspective of policies, right? So you've done that significance of your study in relation to policies. Now when you begin your literature review, you look into it and you write some dot points or some sort of some dot points to reiterate your framework. But now we will be using it as some principles, guiding principles. If your framework, to say it again, doesn't have answers to all the questions which I posed here, you would do well if you actually added these concerns. Because when you teach, it doesn't matter whether your subject area of your research is the classroom discipline, self-regulation, reading, problem-based learning. Doesn't matter which subject you took, you in classroom are regulated by principles that guide you, which means the overall objectives of your teaching, not of your classroom, not of your lessons, but of your teaching in the school. What are the objectives, right? So all these Melbourne declarations and Australian curriculum, where you find them? Exactly in those policies. How do they construct students? How do they construct the role of a student in the classroom? How do they construct you as a teacher and your role in the classroom? What's the role of resources? Is it to memorize things? How do these policies in relation to your object of study, how do they construct the role of resources in your classroom? Are they just stories or things to memorize, things to manipulate, to develop reflexes in students? What's the role of resources? You may or may not, I haven't thought deep enough on it, you know, so maybe you can ignore what's the role of research in all of that. I think you can just ignore that, but I added it there because I would think about it, right? So what's the role of research? But yeah, so so that's very simple now, right? It's very easy when we read other people's abstracts. They just look like this, all black. And then we read the text, and the text is really long. So it's very easy to get confused, to get swayed by a paper. When I was an undergraduate student, sadly, but that was true, I was studying history. I had to do one major, extra major, and yes, and my lecturers were always telling me that it's all good, Anya, but you are so uncritical. And I couldn't understand what they meant by uncritical. And I think I was at the university that either it was those days that we didn't have enough help, or I was one deaf one, or I was maybe those students who were at that university, it was the University of Queensland, maybe these students knew it and I was just an exception, I don't know. But I was getting good grades, but I was a very good reproducer. I never really thought. So today what I'm saying is you've got a few points that you can write for yourself in your head or in a notebook, you know, to help you break down the abstract into several stages of its development, so you can see more or less what was happening in that article. But when you are summarizing your literature, and when you've discussed all of these points, then in order to be critical, what you need to do is to now produce your story on each paper, or on a few papers that say the same thing, but you produce your story, but you can only do it in relation to some criteria. And that's that beginning, that introduction that you created for your literature review. These are your principles. This is what you know. You've done this in assignment 1, you've researched this, you've written it up. So now you create a few bullet points that summarize your framework, and when you have written up about what a particular article says, when you've summarized it, now in order to analyze it, you relate what you have written that they say to that framework that you have dotted here. I hope this is clear.